Hi everyone and welcome to the Naked Guru Experience. This channel's been going now for 1 year. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to all the subscribers, the 300 plus subscribers that we have that are coming along for the journey and deep diving into some of these interesting conversations with some really interesting people. So the conversation you're just about to see is with Dr. Rick Strassman, author of DMT, The Spirit Molecule, is one of my personal heroes. It's been good to talk to him. Audio is a little bit rough because he's up in the mountains in New Mexico, so it's okay. It's doable for those of you with patience. We also have the interview with Chris Beisch, LSD in the Mind of the Universe, and next week I will be interviewing Rupert Sheldrake, who is also one of my all-time heroes. So this content is really for people that are into psychology, philosophy, spirituality, and psychedelics. So it's pretty niche stuff, but if that's what you're into, that's what we talk about on this channel. So we're really deep diving into what do these experiences mean, people that are going through their own experiences, their own journey of personal growth. I think it's useful. It's useful to listen to these people talk about their perspectives. And everybody in the world has a perspective, right? And everybody has an interesting story to tell. So right now I'm only producing about one video a week. But I think we're going to hype this up over this coming year. I really want to get talking to as many people as possible. I'd also like to take my subscribers on a journey into Thailand and Bali and some of the places where I go and live. So thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking the content. And I hope you enjoy it. That's the main thing. Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to the Naked Guru Experience. These are conversations of psychology, spirituality, philosophy, and consciousness. As ever, it really helps if you like and subscribe to the channel. And a big thank you to our sponsors, the Psychedelic Society. Today's discussion is with Dr. Rick Strassman. And just a reminder, today we'll be giving away a free copy of Rick's latest book, which will be announced at the end of this discussion. Dr. Strassman is an American clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. He has held a fellowship in clinical psychopharmacology research at the University of California and was a professor of psychiatry for 11 years at the University of New Mexico. From 1990 to 1995, Dr. Strassman conducted U.S. government-approved and funded clinical research at the University of New Mexico, in which he injected 60 volunteers with DMT, one of the most powerful psychedelics known to man. His detailed account of those sessions is an extraordinary inquiry into the nature of the human mind and the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. He is author of numerous books, including DMT, The Spirit Molecule, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, and his latest book, Joseph Levy, Escapes Death. Welcome, Rick, and thank you for agreeing to the discussion.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, Rick, I know you have many podcasts and many discussions online, and many of them detail the intricate workings and dynamics of those studies that took place in the 90s. In fact, they go into a lot of detail on how you got the approved funding and approved government approval. So what I was hoping to do today is attempt the impossible and cover all three of the main works, the DMT, the Spirit Molecule, DMT, the Soul of Prophecy, and your latest work that I've just finished, Joseph Levy, Escapes Death. So I'm hoping to really go quite broad with our view, if that's okay with you.
Sure. And, we could make passing mention of the book I co-authored called Inner Paths to Outer Space. That came out a few years after the DMT book.
Perfect. So I just wanted to start with, for those that are familiar with DMT, that already know the territory very well, but for those that aren't, I wonder if you just give us a definition of what is DMT and what is the topic of our discussion really today.
Well, DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's a relatively simple psychedelic drug. Simple in as much as it's not chemically complicated. It's not much larger than blood sugar, glucose. So it's kind of the prototypical psychedelic, especially in the family of tryptamine psychedelics, which includes LSD and psilocybin. It's structurally structurally related to serotonin and melatonin. That is, its chemical formula looks like serotonin and melatonin. Um, um, it's quite profoundly psychedelic, and one of its unique characteristics is that it's found widely distributed in the natural in the natural world. Dozens, if not hundreds of plants, every mammal that's been investigated to date, including humans. Um, it was first discovered in plants from Latin America that produced psychedelic effects, and it was discovered to be, or it was determined to be psychedelic itself, the pure substance, in the 1950s. Stephen Czar discovered that in Hungary when he couldn't get LSD behind the Iron Curtain. It was then discovered to be in mammal lungs, brain, blood, including humans, and it was studied relatively intensely in the 1960s. But then human studies with it and every other psychedelic ended in 1970. But basic science studies continued with the psychedelics, the discovery of serotonin receptors, especially due to the relationship of LSD to serotonin. So so back in college, I decided I was going to do clinical psychedelic drug research, and when I was looking for a compound to study, I decided to look at DMT. It's short acting. It was relatively obscure at the time that I was applying for permission and grants. Um, the short acting property was important because I knew I'd be doing the studies in a hospital, and I wanted to minimize any prolonged exposure to stressful circumstances, a stressful environment. The drug I studied, I began in 1990, and we also began doing some dose finding work with psilocybin the last year, 18 months of my tenure at UNM, and then wrapped the studies up in 1995. And I've been writing, and doing clinical psychiatry since then.
Perfect, perfect. And if you could you just run us through the overall paradigm of the study, the overall method, and possibly we're going to touch on results just while we kind of summarize the first book, so we can move on to the other two, which are less discussed.
Well, the studies were basic psychopharmacology studies. We began looking at normal volunteers who were experienced psychedelic users, but otherwise completely normal, psychologically stable. No history or current medical or drug abuse kinds of problems. The first studies that you do with any new drug is to do what's called a dose response project. You give small, medium, large doses as well as placebo. Characterize as many parameters as you can. And in our case, we were looking at ones that were deemed potentially regulated by serotonin, because the classical psychedelic drugs affect serotonin transmission in the brain. So we looked at a slew of endocrine variables, cortisol, prolactin, beta endorphin. We looked at heart rate and blood pressure response, core temperature, pupil diameter, and we also characterized the subjective effects as best we could. Both with careful interviewing after they came down, and also we developed a new rating scale to quantify the effects. So we infused the drug intravenously, because it's usually smoked in the field, recreationally, or in more casual environments. And because the study was funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, we needed to duplicate the experience of the smoked as best we could. So we infused it over about a half a minute into the vein, then flushed the line with some sterile salt water. And effects would begin within a couple of heartbeats, actually. And those were noted to be a feeling of intense inner tension, as it were, excitement, agitation, acceleration, which everybody ended up calling the rush. The visual structure in the room began to break up around the same time, and then with eyes closed, people would dissociate. They would lose awareness of their bodies within maybe a half a minute or a minute. And then they would enter into this world of light, this discarnate world of light, which was full of stuff with which the beings or with which the volunteers interacted. Sometimes this stuff took the form of beings, these intelligent, humanoid or other shaped figures, whirling, buzzing, massive, or quite intensely saturated colors. In the beginning, there might be a crinkling or a high-pitched, sound as one is leaving one's body. The emotional state could be, it was usually ecstatic, but, sometimes it was relatively neutral, or, sometimes quite frightening. Yeah, so, the volunteers interacted with these things, or then, the space, asked questions, got answers, had things done to them, did things, to that space. There was only one volunteer that had the typical white light mystical experience. And interestingly enough, he was somebody with a strong interest in that kind of experience. Other people came at the study from different perspectives. So you start coming down at about 5 minutes. You're able to talk at about 15 or 20, and then in a half hour you're drinking tea, answering questionnaires. We did another study after that, seeing if we could develop tolerance to closely spaced repeated dosing of DMT, and we couldn't. We gave a high dose 4 times in the morning, separated by a half hour, and we determined that there is no tolerance to the psychological effects of DMT. You get as intoxicated with the 4th dose as you do with the first. Then we looked at some other receptors which we thought might be involved in the DMT effect. One of the subtypes of the serotonin receptor. And then we started some dose finding work with psilocybin, and then started just winding down around 1995. Well, I had gone into the research, determined to discover if DMT was inherently spiritual. Did it possess pharmacological spirituality, as it were? In other words, if you just gave the drug to people without a lot of preparation, expectations, would they have a mystical experience? My theory, was that brain levels of DMT in humans, might increase at the time of non-drug spiritual states, or highly altered states, like mystical experience or alien abductions or near-death states. And if giving DMT replicated certain features of those experiences, that would support the idea that naturally occurring DMT might play a role in those non-drug so-called states. But we didn't find that with minimal preparation, but plenty of support. The volunteers just had the trips that they needed, or that they wanted even. Someone with an experience, with a big interest in the near death state had one. A software designer saw the origin of the zeros and the ones coming out of white space. Somebody interested in aliens experienced an alien abduction kind of effect. So it wasn't inherently spiritual. It just kind of shone a spotlight, as it were, on the more or less conscious contents of the person's pre-existing personality. So I got the answer to that, and then the psychopharmacological model was kind of painting me in a corner. I had to start treating my volunteers as large lab rats, as it were, blocking this receptor, scanning that part of the brain, those kinds of things. So it seemed as if the benefit was starting to be outweighed by potential risks, or in a way information that wasn't really relevant to my original interest. So there was nobody else to really help me out at the time. I mean, our work at UNM was so far off the curve. I really couldn't recruit any coworkers or colleagues. So yeah, at a certain point I said, okay, I've done what I wanted to do. I got American research off the ground, and I answered the question about the inherent spirituality of the drug, and then I figured I should leave while I could.
And so for you, the data suggested then that these experiences were more subjective experiences than objective experiences. They were created in the mind of the volunteer, or they weren't literally journeying outside of the body, as you just mentioned there.
Well, they were determined by the personality of the volunteer. So whether that means that their personality determined what their brain generated, or if their personality determined what they received from the outside, like an objective download. So that's kind of the big question: is it internally generated, or externally existent, and we're just being able to perceive it now with our brains receiving characteristics being changed. I just don't think we can find out. But I think what we what we do know is that our personality and what's in our minds determines what the experiences are like.
In answer to the question of why a human being is set up to have these experiences, what is your view on that?
Well, it would depend on your perspective. If you're of the bottom up kind of model, neurotheology, then these experiences can produce some evolutionary advantage, some fitness of selection. Let's say if you're able to activate your imagination in a way through these substances, even naturally through elevated brain DMT on your own, if such a thing happens, you might be more creative. You might be able to problem solve better. Your perceptual apparatus might be more finely tuned, more sensitive. So there are those kinds of theories. The other theory is a top-down model. That DMT exists in order for us to communicate with externally existent realities, and it provides the the matrix for certain elements of spiritual downloading, the imaginative ones, so to speak, the visual effects, auditory effects, emotional, and then your personality needs to extract information. Your intellect needs to understand what the visions represent. I got into the notion of Hebrew biblical prophecy after finishing the DMT work, and I proposed a top-down model, theoneurology, where God made us with the ability to secrete DMT in response to a spiritual download or the prophetic experience, and the visions contain divine information and are determined divinely, and then we need to use our intellect to understand what they mean. The more the more confusing question or pressing question is, why would brain levels of DMT increase at death? And that was a theory that I put out a while back in the DMT book, and was confirmed last year by a group of DMT researchers in Michigan. That in the dying rodent, the brain concentrations of DMT increase quite strikingly. So why would that be the case? One of the hints is that in a test tube, DMT will protect nerve cells from damage caused from low levels of oxygen. So you could speculate that DMT is released to minimize the brain damage which might occur in a heart attack or a stroke or other fatal or potentially fatal conditions. But still, that begs the question regarding why is DMT so psychedelic? Couldn't you just secrete a substance which made you feel calm or tranquilized you or was warm and fuzzy, to help ease the transition to dying? But instead, the brain increases the amounts of this incredibly strange hallucinogen. So does that mean that the near-death experience is the beginning of what it's like without a body?
Yeah, I mean, the top-down explanation sounds a lot more interesting to me than the bottom-up one. It's a lot more exciting. Let's say that. I guess coupled with the subjective data as well, near-death experience being so similar to the DMT experience. The studies that are finding this in rats, have there been any human trials yet, or is it even possible?
No. Yeah, it is possible. They would be, like at this point, rather invasive studies. I mean, I don't know how many people would volunteer to have a brain biopsy as they're dying, but some people, might volunteer to do that. In which case, you could look at brain levels of DMT or activation of the genes which are responsible for DMT synthesis. Do they go up in selected areas of the brain? You could give DMT to people that have had an NDE and compare the two states. Somebody could say, oh yeah, that was just like my NDE that occurred in an automobile accident. So those are two possible studies. There was a study, a survey study done by the group at Imperial College in London, where they gave questionnaires to people that have used DMT, and they gave the same questionnaires to other people that had an NDE, and compared them, and they found a pretty strong resemblance. But another group a few months later published a paper which pointed at ketamine having a much more greater resemblance with a naturally occurring NDE. So the jury's out. I think the ultimate study will be to look at the biology of the brain, get a brain biopsy as people are dying. I suppose you could also put people on a scanner as they're dying, to determine if there's more DMT made, but I don't think we quite have the technology, to see if there's more, DMT being produced in the living brain.
Rick, can the blood concentration of DMT be measured at the point of death? No.
Well, concentrations in the blood are really low, and we just can't really measure them quite yet. So we need to be more local, like in the brain, or else, perhaps other parts of the body make, DMT, during death, and you could look at, the genetic activity. But blood levels, they're just a little too low in the billionth of a gram, per milliliter.
Right, I see. Now, I mean, just before we move into your work with the Hebrew Bible, I just wanted to cover two things. Number one was endogenous DMT made in the body, contained in any foods or anything like that. Could you speak on that briefly for the endogenous DMT and the findings on that?
Well, if you swallow DMT, it's broken down in the gut, in the stomach, and in the small intestine. So you could eat a lot of DMT, and you won't experience any effects. That's the beauty or the charm or the magic of ayahuasca. It contains a plant with DMT and also one that inhibits the breakdown in the gut. So you can swallow DMT and get an orally active preparation. There are, foods, especially, plants that contain, DMT, but if you eat them, by themselves, they're not going to have any effect because of the gut.
Right. And the second question that came from some of our viewers was regarding the pineal gland and its importance in this whole mystery.
The pineal gland, yeah, that's really been, it's kind of like a tar baby, or, like a huge, ball in your mouth. You can't swallow it and you can't spit it out. Y- y- yeah. Well, once upon a well, when I first got interested in scientifically studying consciousness, I learned about the pineal gland from Jim Fadiman at Stanford when I was 20 years old. Jim was working at the School of Engineering as a consulting psychologist, and I was an undergraduate. And Jim and I met one day, and he said, "Look into the pineal gland." This was 1972. And I said, "What's that?" And so I started to, read up on it, and it seemed, mysterious, biologically, but this whole, mythology or esoteric, physiology had built up around it over thousands of years in the East and the West. And it was supposed to be the location anatomically or energetically of the highest possible, religious state. So I thought, well, I wonder if the pineal gland biologically can be determined to be involved in non-drug religious experience. Um, so I started to think, well, maybe DMT is made in the pineal. There's a lot of evidence, circumstantial evidence. Concentrations of the necessary ingredients are quite high in the pineal. The enzymes, the genes that make the enzymes are quite active in the pineal. So it only made sense that that the DMT machinery is going on in the pineal gland. And the group in Ann Arbor, Gimo Borgigian, looked at this in 2013, I believe, and they discovered DMT in the living rodent pineal gland. But this paper that came out last year from the same lab indicated that it's indicated that it isn't the pineal gland that's making the DMT, it's the brain, which in a way is a lot more interesting. And it turned out that the study which demonstrated DMT in the pineal gland used a probe that went through the brain in order to get to the pineal and snagged some brain tissue on the way in or out, and that was the source of the DMT that they found in that study. But still, they really worked hard to explain why pineal gland does not make DMT, because you would think it would, just based on the biology. So they kind of speculated about movement of precursors from one enzyme to the other, and so forth. Uh, but I don't think the story is yet shut on the pineal gland and DMT.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of people looking at it from different ways, and who really knows conclusively. So moving into your later works now, and what for me is the real exciting bit, because it gets a little bit existential and gets a little bit. I think it's from you, Rick Strassman, and not only the science. And so, in your individual research, and then obviously going on into your life, into this autobiography that you've written. But first of all, could we go through what was the inspiration behind DMT and A Soul of Prophecy, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about your key, what that book is exploring.
Yeah, well, there were two. There was a confluence of at least two major streams that led me to write that book. One was that I didn't really have a model to understand people's experiences on DMT from my study. But the volunteers and I were both expecting these white light, mystical, unitive, ego content free states, and that wasn't the case. It was very busy and a lot of interaction, and the personality, the ego, the observing self was maintained, even strengthened. There was the passage of time, there was space. Yeah, so in a way it couldn't have been more contradictory to my expectations and those of the volunteers. So that was the content. Wasn't consistent with my original hypothesis. The truth, value too, didn't quite, fit in, or the explanatory models that I brought to bear didn't quite, fit in. This is your brain on drugs didn't quite fit. Uh, this is, repressed impulses and conflicts being expressed as a result of the drug. It's just your mind reacting on the way to the formless, ultimate, highest possible state. They all, all of those three models, the ones I brought to bear, the psychopharmacologic, the psychoanalytic, and the Zen Buddhist, they all posited the basic unreality of what people had just undergone. But the hallmark of the DMT experience is that it's more real than real. It's the most real thing they've ever encountered.
Yeah.
So I would, kind of interact with my volunteers, and I'd say, oh yeah, it's this, or oh yeah, it's that, and they'd say, no, it's what it was. It was the strangest, most compelling thing I've ever apprehended in my entire life. So it was, the content of the experiences, and the striking reality sense. And scientific theories were interesting from a mechanistic point of view. Might be dark matter, parallel universes, brain activation of this or that. But it didn't really address the more important issue, to me anyway, which is, if you have the experiences, what do they mean? What are they good for? What kind of information is available in them? What kind of tools are available to extract information? Are you a better person? Can you communicate such experiences in a way that improves the world? So the other major discipline that's looked at highly altered states in a systematic way are the religious traditions. And I had exhausted the Buddhist one, which is the other stream, which kind of pushed me into the Hebrew Bible. My Zen community didn't like me talking about psychedelics and Buddhism. So we parted ways at a certain point, and I was kind of bereft of a spiritual tradition. I had been with this Buddhist group for over 20 years. So I kind of stumbled upon some Jewish, books when I was wandering through a New Age bookstore in this small town in Washington where I was living at the time. And I always like to, read the, well, yeah, once I encounter a new thinker or a new discipline, I like to go to the original literature. And when it comes to Judaism, it's the Hebrew Bible, the fundamental text, both of it and of Christianity, basically. Not quite as much for Islam, but without the Hebrew Bible, there would be no Christianity. So it's a powerful book. It's been around a long time, and it presented a view or a spiritual worldview, which I became curious about at a certain point. So I started reading the Hebrew Bible, retaught myself biblical Hebrew, found the classical commentaries from the Middle Ages, translated, of course, and then after a while, the notion of the prophetic state began to dawn on me. And the prophetic state is any spiritual experience recounted in the text in the Hebrew Bible. It could be unusual courage. It could be inspiration to sing or to write poetry, to rule, to make judgments. It could be full-on visions of God and angels. It could be out-of-body experiences, visions of flames and angels and flight through space and clairvoyance and clairaudience. Or it could be just a dream that comes true later on. So there are stages of the prophetic experience. It isn't only foretelling or predicting, which is more which is more of an artifact of the translation of the Hebrew word for the prophet into Greek, which was the first non-Hebrew version of the Bible. Because the Greeks were interested in divining. Like an altered state would help you divine. In other words, to determine the the future. So when the Greeks began to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, that's the way they translated the Hebrew word for the prophet, seer or diviner, foreteller. But it can be any spiritual experience. So I started to look at if there are stages of prophecy, from high to low, what are they like? And they're very much like the DMT effect, phenomenologically anyway. The visions and the voices, the physical experiences, the emotional ones. So and the prophetic experience is the most profound and real encounter of the figure's life. I mean, it's revolutionary. It completely captivates them. It sweeps away ongoing everyday reality, which is another hallmark of the DMT experience. And it's considered real. It's considered the hallmark, the highest point of spiritual evolution. So it isn't disregarded as something else. It's the it's the peak experience within the Western spiritual tradition. So I compared the phenomenology of the two states, the DMT state and the prophetic state, and there's a really striking overlap. So that confirmed anyway that I was kind of on the right track. The main difference obviously is the enduring nature of the message of the prophetic experience as opposed to anything comparable in the message of the psychedelic state or of the DMT state. So that got me thinking about so where does the information reside? Why didn't the DMT volunteers have experiences with the same impact as the prophetic experience as recorded in the text? So that got me to start speculating about different mechanisms of action. But the bottom line with regard to DMT and the prophetic state is it got me convinced or pointed to the role of DMT in the imagination. And by the imagination, I mean any mental activity which is non-abstract. So that's your perceptions, your feelings, your emotions, your physical sensations, um, those kinds of things. And that's where the DMT state and the prophetic state overlapped. It is with respect to the intellect, the rational mind, the part of the mind that abstracts, that deals in thoughts, rather than perceptions. That's that isn't as impacted by DMT, um, as compared to the imagination.
Yes, and for the psychedelic experience in comparison to the prophetic experience, there are many that do end up making some very life-changing decisions or adopt a higher sense of morality within their life. Did you find overlap there as well with that? The resulting lifestyle changes, I mean.
Well, when you're speaking of the full-on prophetic experience, the canonical one, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Moses, Abraham, those all in, well, so those all involve a mission.
Mm,
Um, you're assigned a mission, uh, and that's to communicate the divine word to the community. No matter what the consequences, which are often or can be dire, for the prophet. Um, so I don't really think, I'm thinking about were there lifestyle changes uh, induced by prophetic experience in, biblical, figures, and I can't really, think of any other than a complete, revolution in, the person's life. They became a prophet, rather than becoming a vegetarian.
mm. Did you find any evidence in your research that there was any chemically induced prophetic message, i.e., were they using any form of DMT, the acacia bush, Moses' burning bush, of course? Did you find any link there that these could have been induced states?
There just really isn't any evidence in the text for the use of external agents, exogenous substances. It could be the acacia was a burning bush, and DMT was released, but that was just Moses, one time. And there were theories about the ergot alkaloids and manna perhaps, but there is no evidence of people tripping out on the manna. It just sustained them for food. Um, the only possible reference is the holy incense which the high priest burned on the Day of Atonement once a year in the Holy of Holies. And if you read the verse in Leviticus, you can translate it in such a way as it indicates that the high priest saw God through the agency of the incense. But still, that's one person once a year. So I think if you do away with search for exogenous agents and instead look at the possible production of naturally occurring DMT, I think that's a bit more of a parsimonious explanation.
Right, and your so the theory is that God communicates with man um, when God chooses to, but we can induce glimpses of this with the chemicals. Would that be right, or could you elaborate on it? Or
Yeah. Well, I think if you smoke DMT or you take DMT in and you have a prophecy, a an experience that shares features with a prophetic state, um, it's more of a facsimile. It's more of a mimetic. That's where I see a stumbling block in discussions of giving psychedelics, and they cause a mystical experience.
Mm.
Early on, the Hopkins groups described the states as mystical like, but as time has gone on, they've been emboldened and just call them mystical experiences. But that's the theological notion, and there's really even though there's phenomenological resemblance, um, I mean, you could, look at a very good, duplicate, a, very good, replication of a beautiful piece of art, a painting or a sculpture, and it's just as inspiring, or almost just as inspiring. Very difficult to tell from the real thing, but they're different. One is the original, one is a facsimile. But that isn't, to say, that there is no impact of experiencing, the facsimile. It can move you, it could heal you, it could do all kinds of things. But I think to equate the two because of scores on rating scales and perhaps descriptions of the clinical effect, I think that's that could be problematic. So it's the same thing with the prophetic state. It is like a duplicate or a facsimile, but still it isn't without impact. You can be quite moved. You could even start to preach. You could start to heal. You could change your life around for the better or for the worse. Um, but yeah, they can have the same profound effect, but the mechanism is different. The way they come about, the nature, the location of the information that is revealed and extracted.
And so in your view, is then the God we're talking about, the Abrahamic God, is it the arbiter of these experiences? I mean, are we talking about in your view in this book a chosen few that are given this prophetic vision, or is it a random happening?
Well, you gotta be careful there, and some people have been careful, and some people have stepped into the controversy. Um, there are a couple of issues at hand here. One is the whole, notion of, is there still prophecy? And, the rabbis a long time ago, over 2,000 years ago, declared an end, to prophecy, that it was no longer happening.
Right.
But if you study the circumstances, for their declaration, it was as much cultural and political as it was theological, and they bent over backwards to explain why did God decide to withhold prophecy. But I don't think it's biologically defensible. And, and the biological part is upheld by the more philosophically inclined of the medievalists, especially Maimonides, who has a great line in his book saying, God does not withhold from the worthy. So if you've done all the things that you need to do to become a prophet, it ought to devolve upon you. You ought to be able to experience your prophecy. So Maimonides, well, yeah, man, it's universally accessible. If you have a brain, if you have an imagination, if you have an intellect, and you train yourself, you're virtuous. You occupy yourself with Torah study. You master the sciences and the arts. Then you ought to be able to experience the prophetic state. Yeah, and that's across the board. It's a universal thing. So Maimonides, had to, come up with a miracle. He said it's the miracle of withholding of the prophetic experience. Everybody ought to be able to experience prophecy, but it's been withheld, and God knows why, or only God knows why. So it's complicated. If you look at the outskirts of Judaism, Kabbalah, Hasidism, there's plenty of prophecy. The masters, uh, fly to heaven, experience trips, come back down, and teach. But it isn't really, what would be mainstream, traditional Judaism. It still kind of inhabits, the periphery. But that is a bit of caveat against the notion of prophecy ending. Whether everybody can become a prophet is also pretty controversial because that gets into racial questions. One of the great medieval philosophers, Judah Halevi, wrote a book called the Kuzari in 1200 or so, 1100. And in that book, he states that only a Jewish person or a Jewish convert, or the children of a Jewish convert, so only a born Jew or the child of a convert to Judaism, could experience the prophetic state, and it only could occur in the land of Israel. So it starts to get kind of particular,
And
as
controversial.
opposed to universal at that point. Very controversial. So if you look carefully, there are pros and cons within the tradition. Maimonides expresses it as universally potential, but for whatever reason isn't available across the board. And Judah, and so Judah, the Levite, describes it as still possible, but under conditions which at the time no longer existed. So, people couldn't go to Israel, or very few Jewish people went to Israel. But if you did, you were capable of experiencing the prophetic state.
Yes, it seems every serious conversation I have about psychedelics with multiple people in the field from multiple disciplines, whether it be Buddhism, Hinduism, people working with LSD seriously or DMT seriously, we get to this word God. And I ask, and I have asked now hundreds of people, what is their personal definition of this? And I'd like to ask you, if that's okay, Rick, how are you defining it? We did actually touch on this in our private call, how many people have a concept of a oneness, of a whole, of the individual is God, a microcosm of God, of the unity of all. What is it for you?
Well, it took me some time to get my head around the notion of God. The second word in Genesis is God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So there are a couple of names of God in the Hebrew Bible. Two in particular. YH, VH, and Elohim. There are a handful of others, but they don't appear with anything close to that frequency. I first got a foothold on the notion of God from my Buddhist studies, and that had to do with the idea of cause and effect. The Buddha taught everything which is now has precedence. There are causes to all effects. Everything which is an effect has got causes. So if that's the case, then cause and effect has got a beginning and a middle and an end as well. When did cause and effect begin? Was it always in effect, or was it created like everything else is? So that's one of the questions which is discouraged in Buddhist training. What was before anything. That's called one of the questions which isn't conducive to your enlightenment. which is the kind of question that I'm, drawn to. Like, if you're not supposed to think about it, like, why not? Yeah, so I, began to think about, well, who, who created, or, what created cause and effect, and, what sustains cause and effect. So, the other thing about, cause and effect is that, classically it's, taught to be a completely, neutral, value neutral, phenomena, the relentless, turning of the wheel of karma. You know, you know, um, but if you look at reality, at, cause and effect, there seems to be a quality to cause and effect. It, seems to be encouraging certain kinds of behavior, and it seems to be discouraging other types of behavior. It's, discouraging you from being angry. It encourages you to be loving. So who determined the quality of cause and effect? Why is cause and effect arranged in the way that it is, to encourage certain things and discourage others? So that led me to the idea of, God as the creator and sustainer of cause and effect. So God determined the direction that cause and effect goes, and created it, and keeps it going. So that was my fundamental definition of God. Defining God's activities. How you know of God, how you can intuit or extrapolate or infer, the existence and the nature of God.
And do you conceptualize that as something external to yourself, or in a Hindu sense, in a kind of Atman sense? Are you a fractal of it? Are you, in essence, it, as long with everybody else, of course?
No. I mean, I'm a crazy dualist. I mean, to think of yourself as God. I mean, please, think about it. Did you create the heavens and the earth? Did you create all the stars? Do you things hanging together? Did you create cause and effect? Yeah. So I think we could consider ourselves as God's creations, and we possess a soul. We possess a soul, which is divine, implanted by God, and then taken back by God when we die. But there's a huge difference between between us and God. So it kind of drives me crazy when people say, we're God, I am God, and I'd say, please, you're God. Look around.
I bet that is quite unpopular in some circles, Rick.
Oh, a couple of weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a non-duality event, or like a month ago, and I spoke to the organizer, and I said, if I speak, I'm just gonna trash the notion of non-duality. I don't believe it. I think it's a dangerous illusion, and this is what I think. So she said, well, maybe some other time. So I said, fine. Yeah, it's not kumbaya. I wouldn't really, contribute, to that ethos. Yeah, so yeah, within the psychedelic community, it's a bit of a tough, it's almost a hard sell. But
can I ask you briefly,
that's okay.
Just there about you mentioned that the idea of non-duality is potentially dangerous. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
It is a statement about a completely different level of reality than that which we inhabit. I spoke with a Tibetan teacher, a lama up in Victoria, Canada, where I lived for a while. I was having marital problems at the time. And I was able, to arrange a private audience. And I said, isn't it all one? Why are we not getting along? I mean, aren't we, basically the same? And he said, that's, the ultimate. That's, the ultimate level of reality, and we aren't there. Uh, there's the relative and, there's the absolute. And he said, it's 99.99%, the relative. So if you want to pretend it's all one, you could, but you're, denying the fact that we live in a relative universe, a relative world. It's interactive. We are interacting. We're not merging with everything all the time. We're interacting with things all the time. So I think the problem is how to understand differences, and how to understand in interaction. So that I think is where the non-dual state is alluring. You don't have to think. If the non-dual state is free of thought, you don't have to think. And most people are really confused about things. But it isn't a question of not thinking. It's a question of thinking better. Thinking along the lines of things that are more in line with the nature of reality, rather than just our fantasies or imaginations, which bump into reality and they stress us out. So we want to be in a non-dual, thoughtless condition.
Now, has your research with DMT strengthened strengthened your convictions, your spiritual convictions, from the evidence that you've acquired through your experience, your time working on it and with it, its effect on the participants? Has this affected you personally, spiritually? Has it kind of convinced you further of a divine nature of the cosmos?
Well, I think my work with DMT and the existence of DMT, led me to a spiritual worldview that I'm developing and studying now, as opposed to it convincing me of the reality of the spiritual world and its importance. If that makes sense. I suppose DMT was the finger pointing at the moon. It isn't the moon, but it got me interested in the moon, and it pointed me toward the Hebrew Bible and the prophetic experience. But it isn't. It was just a very striking signpost. So even though I still am current in the field, I consult, I teach, I do, this and that on my review, papers for consideration for publication. I'm in scientific journals. The meat of what my life is about is studying the text and trying to understand what it means, and thinking about that, writing about that, talking about it.
Yeah, and I think it takes us quite nicely into your latest book, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. Now, I actually listened to this book via audio, which is what we're going to be giving away to one of our listeners as well. I defined it as a autobiographical, medical black comedy. That was my best way of defining it. It was at times very, very funny. If you get the sense of humor, like it's a dark comedy, and I found it very funny. And what I found it was deeply humbling in a way, because when we imagine our death, we imagine that we're going to have this beautiful drama where all the family stand around the bed and we say our goodbyes, and it's all beautiful and dramatic and romanticized. But this book, which catalogs your potential near death, is not as glamorous or romantic as that. In fact, it's pretty crude at times. So yeah, that was my review. And so if you could tell us a bit about the inspiration for it. And I think it's, by the way, Rick, as well, it gives us an insight into your mind. I felt like I was in your mind for a few hours.
Well, sure. Well, so how did you like the narrator?
Oh, I thought fantastic. Yeah, he spoke in that kind of dry, slow, dragging voice, which gave it a lot of character, I thought.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with how it turned out. Well, the inspiration was true life events. I came down with pneumonia in 2014, and was admitted to the local community hospital, and I was just manhandled. I mean, I was manhandled. And then I went home and developed a super bug, diarrhea for 6 weeks, where I lost 15 pounds, and nobody knew what to nobody knew what to do. So I got over it, and just spent 9 months recovering. So that was the inspiration for the story. I changed the names and the places and the genders and the professions and all that of a number of the circumstances of the book, but it's all based on a true story. It's based on a true story, as seen through the perspective of a caricature or an amplification of certain certain aspects of my personality. Medical minded, introspective, psychologically minded, kind of anxious, kind of entitled, confused, grasping on, to whatever, concepts or beliefs I could, hang on to at the time. Fighting for my life for a good couple of months. And the, the two, lowest, points of both the pneumonia and of the, superbug, they were kind of disgusting, or at least not dramatic. The pneumonia, my blood pressure was falling. I was going into shock, and nobody really paid attention. They just kind of ignored me. So it was it was kind of like the lights were dimming. The volume of my life was being turned down. It wasn't psychedelic at all. I suppose if I had died, there may have been a period where it was DMT like, but it was anything but. It was like a major downer. And when I was struggling with superbug, I was just kind of fading away as opposed to anything spectacular. And I was alone in both of those conditions. So I really had to rally, like what's actually, sustaining me, who's helping me or what's helping me. So that was, I think, a opportunity to, kind of strengthen my faith and, gratitude, toward the, creator and the sustainer of cause and effect. Thank you, God, I'm still alive.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of my main questions for this that I have written here is, was it life-changing? I realized the character was an amplification of your traits. He's not an overly likable character, if you don't mind me saying.
No, he's pretty prickly.
It made me a little bit cautious of the interview, to be honest. I thought, is he going to be like this in real life? And you're not. It's very, very different. Like you say, it's an amplification of this melancholy. That's how I heard it.
Well, yeah, and quite funny too. I'm a pretty funny guy, but it requires a certain stance to appreciate my humor. So I think people without a sensitive humor do struggle with that book. They find the guy thoroughly unpleasant, as opposed to just partially unpleasant, but also kind of funny. So
yeah, certainly funny.
Yeah, it's yeah, but some people are incapable of appreciating the humor in the book, which is kind of an interesting psychological profiling or test of some sort. If you give the book to a friend and they say that was not funny, you can kind of categorize them as a particular type. Well, last year Graham Hancock and I were having dinner, and Graham read the book a few weeks before, And at a certain point, during dinner, he, stopped, looked at me in the eye and he said, "What's the difference between you and Joseph Levy?" And I said, "I'm a nicer guy. I'm a nicer guy than Joseph Levy." So, that was my, 3-word answer, or, 4-word answer.
Yeah, and I noticed within the book as well, you did sprinkle in, I think you only mentioned it once, DMT, but ayahuasca you mentioned it multiple times. You did sprinkle in a little bit of that too. Is it something, yeah, I don't want to go too personal. I know that you do talk about your personal experiences now, but when you're that close to death, do you not feel kind of pulled to use a psychedelic to kind of touch base with where you're going, to take away the anxiety, to balance? Did you not feel that? I almost thought in the book you were going to describe a scene where that happened, but
What kind of scene?
well, I thought you were going to drink ayahuasca or have a mushroom session or something like that in order to kind of get your psychology right. You did mention your Buddhist practice in the book, and you kind of went into depth in your thoughts of where you were spiritually, but you didn't end up having any psychedelic sessions or healing sessions, anything like that.
During the, very, weak part of, my recovery, I was just too frail. I didn't want to, take any chances. After all, I'm, not in my, 20s or 30s or, even 50s anymore. Um, yeah, um, I just wanted to, you know, feel. Yeah, it's a bit hard to describe what my motivation. Well, I could describe what I was doing at the time, to
Mm,
recover. I was, immersed in books. That was my spiritual practice, was to read. So I was just, reading about the Holocaust, because it was I had intimations of, this is what it's, like to die in a concentration camp. You're by yourself, you're ignored, you're taunted, you're just kind of, fading away.
mm,
So being Jewish, what's, the paradigmatic, wasting away experience of this generation anyway, as the Holocaust. So I started reading Holocaust literature. That, led me to, the anti-Semitism literature, which, led me to, Christianity. Um, and the commentators, the medieval commentators, I was just, reading them, their understanding of the text and of life. So I was accompanied by all these Jewish ideas or anti-Jewish ideas, but it was an examination of my faith, or kind of a swimming in my faith. Like, I've taken plenty of psychedelics, and I guess I didn't think they would provide the same kind of meat on the bones as what I was doing at the time. Um, yeah, so this last year, I developed an injury to my arm, and my massage therapist said, well, maybe you should trip, get to the bottom of it.
mm.
Um, but I haven't. I've just worked on it more, gradually, more consciously, more slowly, more, feeling wise. Uh, so it, could be, as, as I'm getting older, I'm more appreciative of the slow and steady wins the race than the, break things open, and have a, peak experience to, shine light on the underlying, the underlying issues. That's not to say that I'm, not interested in, tripping again, but the, circumstances would need to be, they need to be ideal.
Mm.
And I live alone and in a small Christian community, so and friends in, yeah, and it's hard to travel, nowadays, so the opportunity has not quite materialized yet.
I mean, just a quick caveat before we nip back to that book, but one of your first experiences, I think I heard, was with Terence McKenna. Is that correct? With your first exposures with DMT?
Yeah, my first big DMT experience was with Terence. I think 1986. Yeah, yeah. I just given a talk on the pineal gland and DMT, and Terence was in the audience, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, "You want to try some DMT? Um, get some experiential, firsthand knowledge of the drug." So what am I going to say? No, I'm busy. So I said for sure. Yeah, so Terence supervised my first experience with DMT. Yeah, it was a pretty mind-altering, life-altering, completely unexpected experience. I was I smoked it in a joint, and laid down after 3, 4 big hits. Yeah, and there was this a raging waterfall of flaming colors out of which emerged these beings about 3 to 4 feet tall, maybe half a dozen of them. They looked like aliens, like the bald headed, childlike physique. And they started to chirp at me or to sing song to me. Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see? Over and over and over again. And I was just kind of slack jawed. My mouth was gaping. Yeah, so they repeated that over and over for however long, and then they disappeared back into the waterfall. Things faded.
Mm,
I opened up my eyes. Terence is there. My friends were in the room with me. Yeah, so I
beautiful.
decided, well, yeah, it was beautiful, and I decided at that moment I'm gonna look at DMT. I've been thinking about it. This is the confirmation that I'm on the right track. So like a year later, maybe 2 years later, I was driving home from Canada and stopped off at Cat and Terrence's place in Marin, and we were talking about my melatonin study, and it was kind of dead ending. And he said, well, you need to study DMT. So we spent a whole afternoon up in his library loft, and we just brainstormed for the afternoon, and we decided, well, give DMT to your friends, have the war on drugs fund it, and take it from there. So so that's what basically I ended up doing.
The master plan.
It was going straight into the lion's den. That's the thing we had to decide, to just not shy away from it.
Mm, yeah, and then coming back to the book, you went through such a difficult time with that, with nearly dying and whatnot. Has it made you rethink about your actual death? We can plan our death to some extent, and has it made you put a plan in place as much as that can be achieved, or to maybe go about it another way, or do we really have any choice? I don't know.
Well, we die like we live, right? If you're alone, you die alone. If you've got a large social network, chances are you'll die surrounded by friends and family. But Dogen, the Japanese Zen
And
teacher.
yeah.
There's a line in Zazen rules. The instructions for doing meditation. Nobody knows by the side of what road you'll drop. More or less. So we can plan everything. Live our lives, stack the deck in the way that we hope for things to end. But still, it's as much unpredictable as controllable. Like after I recovered, I got my ducks in a row a bit more, updated my will and power of attorney, got an executor for my trust, established a trust actually, like a living trust. Um, and I got into psychotherapy as I was getting better to understand what the heck just happened to me, and
Mm,
how do I prevent anything like that from happening again. Uh, um, yeah, so think about, my death. Anytime I get a cold or feel a bit under the weather, I have, flashbacks of being back in the hospital and think about, well, get ready to die because you could die right now. Yeah, so it's, definitely, uh, reoriented me, towards greater appreciation of the imminence of death and, how to be ready for it. But still, I don't know, how many of us are, fully ready.
Yeah, no. And are you working at the moment on a sequel to Joseph Levy?
Yeah. Well, I was struggling with what to write the last maybe 6 months or so, and one of my old DMT volunteers actually, we were on the phone, and he said, weren't you working on another installment of Joseph Levy? And I said, oh yeah, you're right. So it was a catalog of his drug and alcohol experiences as a younger man. And I had been, working on it for years. And I went back, to my hard drive and, downloaded stuff. And I've got like 300 pages of, trip accounts and alcohol, drunk accounts. And, it's a young Joseph Levy, gets stoned and gets drunk. And, there's some pretty interesting accounts there. So I've been working on those chapters. Uh, I think, to understand the experiences that the character undergoes with the drugs and alcohol when he's in his teens and 20s, it's important to give some, background, to his upbringing, his, family, his parents, his, teachers and friends,
Yeah.
Religious school. Yeah, so I'll need to, write some new material there. I've got about a quarter of that written. So yeah. That'll be, the new installment. Joseph Levy does drugs, or young Joseph Levy. And the story will, probably end when the gates of the monastery close behind me when I'm 22. I got depressed when I was a first year medical student and I dropped out. It was just too much. And I ended up at a Zen temple. And the gates close behind you and the
Yeah.
new stage of your life begins. So that's when I think young Joseph Levy, volume 1, will stop, is going to end.
I love them. I think they're great. The Joseph Levy character, because it really shows who Rick Strassman is. I don't think we appreciate from DMT, the spirit molecule, who Rick Strassman is, because it's such a scientifically based literature. Of course, your character and your personality is deeply threaded through it, but these stories are far more intimate.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book. I'm a bit of an introvert, and I just hate being, projected onto. Like, if like if I'm in, the center of attention, it feels like, it as much, feels like I have a, bullseye on my back as anything else. I enjoy it, but I, realize it's potentially, dangerous and ephemeral at best. So people assume certain things about me, and that kind of bothered me. And I said, I almost died. I'd like the real story about, or my version of things, or my slant on reality to, be available as much as this figure who wrote the DMT book, or biblical scholar with all of those references to the Bible and the prophecy book. I've got good stories to tell. I'm a good storyteller, the written word anyway. Yeah, and I figured, well, writers write. That's the next thing that seems pressing to get out. Um, so so yeah, it was, it still is a gamble. The evening before the book was published, I was, laying up all night thinking I should, pull the plug, don't let anybody, read this book. You'll just be, people are going to hate you. They'll think you're some kind of a jerk, and, you'll have no more friends. But I figured, well, I wrote the book. It it took 18 months to write. It's an account of a very interesting time in my life. So just let's pull the trigger, let's see where the cards fall. And the book has gotten a very good reception. It was a very small press, just one guy, one man, pressed in Berkeley. So marketing has been a bit of a struggle. But people that read the book, really love it. Or at least the ones that leave comments on Amazon and speak to me, or contact me. They love the book. So even though it's a bit raw and exposes parts of myself that I've mixed feelings about, I think overall it had its intended impact.
Yeah, and I am glad you've released it. And like you say, it's raw and talks about intimate parts of yourself, but there are also intimate parts of all of us. The introvert within all of us is quite self-doubting, somewhat pessimistic at times. We're not all love and light, and I think a lot of it in the spiritual community or the psychedelic community, we can become complacent and think it's all love and light. And to see this kind of the real workings of the inner mind, a lot of your insecurities and my insecurities are human insecurities and life. And I think that's what's refreshing and unique about the book.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, somebody wrote me like a brief review, and they said, great literature extracts meaning from suffering. And I thought that was an accurate rendition of what I was trying to get across. Extract some meaning from suffering. It isn't meaningless. You can learn from it. You can fight against it. You can plead with it. I am glad that you could see the the import or implications of the book.
Yeah. Right. And just my final question, Rick, for today, and it might seem a little bit ad hoc and we've kind of overlooked it through the conversation, but it's something that I wanted to run past you anyway to get your view on. And that is the idea of love, deeply enmeshed in these psychedelic experiences and these experiences of transcendence, religious experiences, near-death experiences. This idea of there is this feelings of bliss and love. This coupled with the similar nature of the DMT molecule with serotonin and this neurotransmitter that you get these feelings of love and bliss. I just wanted to ask you, what is your conception of love and how coincidental that it's so aligned with experiences that we talk of that are deeply related to the idea of God and death and things like that. There seems to be a correlation there. I just wanted to know your view on it.
Love. Well, yeah, you could have asked me a simpler question. Let's see. Love. Well, love is a 4-letter word, right? That's kind of the bottom line. Love. Well, the universe is created, I think, out of a sense of love. God loves his creatures or its creatures. Our being alive is, that's evidence of God's love. Us having free will is evidence of God's love. But as opposed to, some beliefs that, God is only love, I think that's misguided. God is a righteous God, a vengeful God, a jealous God, God that, doesn't forget. You sin, you have to repent or you're punished. So, those all can be understood or explained from the lens of cause and effect. It's just an anthropomorphizing of cause and effect. In other words, you do certain things and there are certain consequences. And if those consequences were the result of the action of a human, this is the way you describe them. But it's impersonal in a way. It's just, cause and effect, a certain kind of cause and effect, which encourages certain behavior and discourages others. So I think, the feeling of, love in the psychedelic state or, religious exaltation has to be balanced with the, notion of, righteousness and, justice. You don't live in the world just based on love. I mean, that's kind of like we're all one. We're all in this white light schmaz kind of notion. There are distinctions. If somebody's coming at you to kill you, what do? Do you love them or do you shoot back? So I think you need to be discriminating, and discrimination involves dealing with duality, which is what we face all of the time. So there is love as evidenced in the nature of existence, but there's also there's also phenomena that point in the other direction. One of our volunteers was a guy that had mostly only taken MDMA. He had tripped on mushrooms once or twice, but he loved MDMA. He came in his tie-dye T-shirt, his long curly permed hair, his groovy granny glasses, and baggy pants, and he was expecting this DMT trip to be all about love and light, and instead he was anally raped by crocodiles. So I think you have to keep your wits about you. If you only choose to see the light and the love, you're going to be surprised, by what the nature of both your reality is and that of the outside world.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think a great end to our discussion. And I would just announce now the winner of your audiobook is Jay Hamilton, one of our subscribers, and I will be contacting them directly to give them a copy of your book. Is there anything else you would like to add, Rick? Any more information you'd like to put out there to our subscribers, our viewers?
Well, if you're interested in contacting me, ordering books, through my website, you can go on to rickstrassman.com, and I answer pretty much every email that I get. And specifically, I've got quite a few of those free promo codes for the Audible book. So if people would like a free copy of the audiobook in exchange for writing a review or telling their friends, I would be happy to give them a free copy.
That's perfect. I mean, you must be replying to a lot of emails, Rick.
I've replied to a lot of emails. Yeah. But it's fun. Like I enjoy it. I qualify my statement that I respond to every email. I used to respond to every email, and I've probably gotten 20,000 over the last 20 years. But there have been maybe 2 or 3 which are really mad and crazy, and I don't respond to those because you have to ignore those kinds of emails. But but I'd say of 20,000 emails I've responded to all but a small handful. I can't promise I will engage in a long-term correspondence, but I will at least respond once.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and thanks again, Rick, for this discussion. I hope we've touched on some key areas here, maybe some points that haven't been covered before. So it's been a delight to talk with you, Rick.
Well, thanks. It was a pleasure. Yeah, I think we covered some interesting territory.
Right, so we look forward to Joseph Levy and number 2, Drugs and Drinks.
Young Joseph Levy. Yeah. Well, God willing. Yeah, I'm been working on it, so hopefully it'll be out sometime next year.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Rick. Dr. Rick Strassman. Thank you very much.